The conservatory, when they entered it some 20 minutes later, presented itself as a study in deliberate arrangement, which was to say that it appeared at first glance to be precisely what one would expect of a woman of Mrs. Hardcastle's age and station, and therefore immediately struck Whimsy as being exactly wrong. The space was substantial, perhaps 30 feet in length and half that in width, with glass panels forming 3 walls, and a glass roof that admitted the fading autumn light in such a manner as to render everything within slightly theatrical, slightly unreal. Terracotta pots lined the shelves with methodical precision, each containing either a dormant bulb or, in some cases, the pale shoots of forced hyacinths and narcissi at various stages of emergence. The air held that particular dampness of cultivated spaces, mingled with the faint mineral smell of soil and the vaguely sweet perfume of early flowers. At the far end, a potting table of substantial construction held the implements of horticultural labor, trowels, secateurs, a pruning knife with an unusually long blade, and scattered across its surface were the remnants of Mrs. Hardcastle's final occupation, broken pieces of terracotta, dried earth, and a wicker basket, identical to dozens of others but notable for being the one upon which the deceased's hand had supposedly lain. Whimsy circled the room with the deliberate movements of a man cataloguing rather than searching, his pale eyes noting with apparent indifference the precise arrangement of objects, the dust patterns on the shelves, the peculiar absence of footprints on the tiled floor despite Mrs. Hardcastle having spent considerable time here. "You see," he remarked to the canon, who trailed behind him with the expression of a man attending his own inquest, "one encounters a great many rooms in the course of investigating deaths, and most of them bear the unmistakable marks of human habitation. A book left open to mark one's place, a cup with the dregs of yesterday's tea, perhaps a shawl draped over a chair. The detritus of life, one might say. Yet this room suggests something rather different, a space prepared, one might almost think, for a performance rather than for living." The potting table drew him as inevitably as metal to a lodestone, and he stood before it with his hands clasped behind his back, studying the arrangement with the intensity of a man reading a text in a language he was only beginning to comprehend. "The basket," he said finally, "is held by the right hand, you say? Mrs. Hardcastle was right-handed?" The canon confirmed this with a somewhat uncertain nod. "At least I believe so. I confess I had never paid it particular attention." Whimsy lifted the basket with surprising gentleness, examining its construction. Willow, well made, the sort one might purchase at any market town for a few shillings. Within it lay a dozen bulbs, each one no different from its fellows, each one suggesting nothing more mysterious than the approaching spring. "And these bulbs are, one presumes, hyacinths, merely awaiting division or replanting?" "I believe so," the canon said. Eleanor was most particular about her bulbs. She had charts, records of where each variety had come from, what she intended to do with them. She was methodical to the point of obsession. "How very sensible of her," Whimsy observed, setting the basket down with the same care he had employed in lifting it. "One does so admire a woman with systems. May we examine these records, the charts, the accounts of her horticultural activities?" The canon produced a leather-bound journal from a small desk positioned beside the far window, a detail that Whimsy noted with evident interest that Mrs. Hardcastle had maintained, a workspace with writing materials, suggesting perhaps that her time in the conservatory had encompassed more than mere gardening. The journal, when opened, revealed page after page of meticulous notation, botanical names in careful copperplate, dates of planting, observations about temperature and moisture, sketches of bulb development at various stages, all entirely unremarkable until one reached the final entries, dated Tuesday, the day of Mrs. Hardcastle's death. The handwriting here became erratic, the lines slanting increasingly to the left, the words compressed as though she had been writing with increasing urgency. "It doesn't matter any more," one passage read, underlined repeatedly. "He knows I know. The pretense has become unbearable. I can feel him watching even here, even in this room where I am supposed to be safe. How does one continue to live when one realizes that the person one lives with is not the person one believed oneself to know?" The entry ended mid-sentence, the pen apparently having been set down with sufficient force to have torn a small hole in the paper. Whimsy read this passage twice, then a third time, his expression remaining entirely neutral, though his fingers had begun that slight tremor that the canon had come to recognize over their university years together as indicating either genuine interest or the onset of boredom. With Whimsy, one could rarely distinguish between them. "Fascinating," he murmured. "Absolutely fascinating. And this entry, the one preceding it, when was it written?" The canon consulted the earlier pages. Monday evening, it appears. The notation about the forced bulbs, the temperature in the frame, ordinary matters. Nothing whatever to suggest. Suggest what, precisely? Whimsy interrupted, not unkindly. The suicide of a woman troubled by her circumstances? Or perhaps the preliminary evidence of a woman preparing for something rather more permanent? Canon, I must ask you a question, and I require absolute honesty in your response, not the sort of carefully constructed truth with which one typically shields one's private griefs. Was your marriage happy? The canon's face underwent a complex series of transformations: embarrassment, indignation, shame, and finally something like resignation. "No," he said quietly. "No, Whimsy. It had not been happy for some considerable time. But I would never have." "Of course not," Whimsy said gently, though his eyes remained fixed upon the wicker basket and its cargo of innocent bulbs. "Yet the question becomes rather pressing, does it not? Because if Mrs. Hardcastle believed herself to be under observation, believed that some presence in this house was monitoring her movements and her thoughts, one must ask oneself whether she was detecting, as it were, an actual presence, or whether she was detecting something far more psychologically complex, the weight of her own unhappiness, manifesting itself as an external threat. He turned to face the canon directly. "Tell me, did she consult anyone? A physician, a spiritualist, She had written to someone," the canon said suddenly. "A week ago, perhaps. I found the draft in her desk. A letter to a woman named Venetia Cross, someone she had known years ago before our marriage. She asked whether the woman remembered certain things, certain events. She asked whether the woman had ever experienced the sensation of being followed by one's own past." Whimsy's expression underwent a subtle alteration, the sort of minute shift in the arrangement of his features that suggested he had just encountered a thread worth pull. Ling, though whether it would unravel into illumination or merely create greater tangles remained to be seen. "Venetia Cross," he repeated, the name emerging from his lips with the careful pronunciation of a man encountering a specimen of particular interest, a rather theatrical appellation for what one presumes was an ordinary acquaintance. "And this letter, the draft, I assume you mean, is it still in her desk, or did Mrs. Hardcastle, in her final hours, retrieve and destroy it?" The canon's hesitation was itself informative. "I placed it in the conservatory desk myself, 2 days ago, when I was searching for, that is, when I was attempting to understand what had driven her to such evident distraction. I thought that if I could locate Mrs. Cross, perhaps I might comprehend what had so disturbed Eleanor's peace of mind. I had assumed it was merely the recollection of some old disappointment, some romantic entanglement from before our marriage, but when Eleanor discovered that I had found the draft, she became quite agitated. She demanded that I return it, that I cease meddling in matters I could not possibly understand. She said that Venetia Cross was not the point, that the point was something far older and far more terrible than any mere acquaintance could represent." Whimsy moved toward the small desk with the purposefulness of a man who has been granted permission to enter a previously locked room, and there, beneath a loose sheet of blotting paper, he discovered not only the draft letter but several others, each one bearing dates, each one apparently abandoned mid-composition. The first, dated 3 months prior, read merely, "My dear Venetia, do you remember the incident with the bells? I find that I cannot stop hearing them." The second, dated 6 weeks ago, continued, "You warned me, but I did not listen. I thought that by marrying, by creating an entirely new Faye in an entirely new place, I might escape what we had seen. But one cannot escape such things, can one? One can only pretend, and the pretense becomes more exhausting with each passing year. The most recent, dated only a fortnight prior, was longer and considerably more urgent. Venetia, I must know. Did you ever tell him? Did you ever speak of what occurred that night? Because I believe, no, I am certain that someone knows. Someone has always known. And they are making certain that I understand that my deception will not go unpunished. Eleanor Wimsey set these pages down with the precision of a man handling historical documents, and turned to face the canon with an expression of polite inquiry that poorly concealed an intensity of interest that bordered upon predatory. It occurs to me, he said mildly, that your wife's spiritual preoccupations and her psychological distress may not be entirely unrelated to these mysterious communications with her former acquaintance. One detects, in these letters, a woman haunted not by supernatural presence, but by historical fact, something that occurred, as she phrases it, that night, something witnessed or perhaps experienced. The question becomes rather pressing. What precisely happened on this evening that so thoroughly disrupted the equilibrium of your wife's existence? The canon had begun to perspire noticeably, though the conservatory remained cool, and his fingers had acquired that furtive quality of a man desperately searching his memory for the precise moment at which his authority over his own narrative had been surrendered. Eleanor and I did not discuss her past, he said finally, his voice taking on the defensive quality of a man reciting a well-rehearsed justification. When we married, it was 34 years ago, in the autumn of 1891, she was already a widow, or so I understood. She had been married briefly to a man named Hardcastle, who died of pneumonia whilst abroad. She had no relations that I knew of, and she seemed content to begin entirely afresh. I believed it was the compassionate thing to do, to refrain from questioning her about her previous life. She seemed relieved, almost, to speak of nothing prior to our meeting. "How very considerate of you," Wimsey observed, though his tone suggested that consideration was precisely the last quality one might attribute to such selective blindness. "And in 34 years of matrimony, it never occurred to you to wonder who or what Venetia Cross might represent? Never occurred to you that a woman who suddenly becomes preoccupied with spiritualism and convinced that she is under observation might be experiencing something rather more substantive than mere nervous indisposition? I assumed," the canon said with some dignity, "that it was the onset of age. Women of Eleanor's years often experience peculiarities of temperament. I consulted Dr. Harrington, and he confirmed my suspicion. He prescribed rest and the reduction of stimulating literature, which is why I had attempted to discourage her reading of those spiritualist texts. I was attempting to be helpful." Wimsey moved toward the window, gazing out at the darkening gardens with the expression of a man watching the pieces of a puzzle arrange themselves according to some internal logic that he alone could perceive. "Dr. Harrington," he said softly. "The local physician, I presume? How long has he been attending this parish?" "Perhaps 8 years," the canon replied, "since Dr. Whitmore retired. A capable enough fellow, though I confess his manner is rather abrupt." "Indeed," Wimsey murmured. "Tell me, Canon, when your wife was discovered dead in this conservatory, with her hand clutching a basket of hyacinth bulbs, did anyone think to examine those bulbs with particular care? Did anyone consider that they might contain something rather more interesting than dormant botanical specimens?" The canon's expression underwent a transformation from confusion to dawning comprehension to genuine alarm. "Good God," he breathed. "You cannot possibly suggest—" "I suggest nothing at this juncture," Wimsey interrupted. "But I do propose that we locate this Venetia Cross with considerable urgency, and that before we do so, we conduct a rather more thorough examination of these bulbs. Because if I am not very much mistaken, Canon, your wife's final message is not one of spiritual torment, but of desperate warning. And the question of precisely what she was attempting to warn you against becomes not merely academic, but potentially explosive." The examination of the hyacinth bulbs proceeded with the methodical precision that Wimsey brought to most of his investigative endeavors, though in this instance his usual air of languid amusement had been entirely displaced by something far more focused and considerably more dangerous. He had appropriated a small knife from the potting table, not the long pruning blade, but a shorter, more delicate instrument, more suited to the task of gentle dissection, and with the canon observing in mounting horror, had begun to carefully section the first bulb, revealing nothing more extraordinary than the papery layers one would expect of such botanical specimens. The second and third yielded similarly disappointing results, and Whimsy was beginning to suspect that his intuition, usually so reliable a guide through the labyrinthine corridors of human motivation, had this once led him astray, when the fourth bulb, nestled in the basket's interior, revealed itself to contain something rather more sinister than horticultural convention would suggest, wrapped within the bulb's protective layers and visible only upon the M. Ost careful dissection was a small packet of folded paper, yellowed with age, inscribed in a hand that Whimsy immediately recognized as matching the urgent script of the final letters to Venetia Cross. The canon made a small sound, not quite a gasp, but something between alarm and recognition, as Whimsy carefully extracted and unfolded the packet, revealing within it what appeared to be a newspaper clipping, dated October 1889, and a handwritten note of considerable length. The clipping itself bore the heading of the Cambridge Chronicle and concerned the death of a student at Trinity College, one Mr. Roland Ashford, whose body had been discovered in the backs, following what the newspaper euphemistically termed an unfortunate accident involving water. The particulars were sparse. The young man had apparently been climbing along the banks in the evening darkness, had lost his footing, and had drowned in the river, despite his companion's heroic but ultimately unsuccessful attempts at rescue. The companion, the article noted, had been another student, though his name had not been recorded, the authorities having been satisfied that the incident was precisely what it appeared to be, a tragic misadventure. "My God," the canon whispered, lowering himself into the nearest chair with the careful movements of a man whose structural integrity had been unexpectedly compromised. Eleanor. Eleanor was at Cambridge? That's impossible. Women didn't attend Cambridge formally, no, Whimsy said, his attention remaining fixed upon the handwritten note, but they were permitted to lodge in the town, to attend lectures informally, to participate in certain intellectual pursuits. And during the late 1880s, when social conventions were becoming somewhat more flexible, it would have been entirely possible for a woman of Eleanor's apparent education and determination to insert herself into academic circles, at least peripherally. He began to read the note aloud, his voice taking on the quality of a man delivering testimony from beyond the grave. "Roland is dead, and I am responsible for his death. Not directly. I did not push him into the river, though God knows I was capable of imagining it. But through my deception and my cowardice, I set in motion the events that led to that moment. Venetia will understand, because Venetia knows what Roland was, what he did to me in that room above the bookshop on Trinity Street. She knows because she was with me when I discovered the courage to refuse him, when I told him that I would not submit to his attentions any longer. What she does not know is that I told someone else as well. I told a young man who had once been kind to me, whose attentions had been honorable and whose heart was pure. I told him in a moment of weakness and desperation, hoping that he might intercede on my behalf, might convince Roland to accept my rejection with grace. Instead, that young man, whose name I will not record for he suffered sufficiently, took it upon himself to challenge Roland to meet him at the backs. I did not know of this confrontation until after Roland's body was discovered. The official account was an accident, and I allowed it to stand. I allowed it to stand because the alternative would have been to admit that I had spoken of my shame, that I had involved another in my humiliation, that I had set in motion a chain of events that resulted in a man's death, however richly he may have deserved it. I have lived these 30 years since believing myself to be a murderer, Venetia. And now I fear that my silence is about to be shattered. The note concluded with a final paragraph that appeared to have been added at a much later date, the handwriting shakier, the words more desperate. He has found out. I am certain that now, the way he looks at me, the small comments about my past, the questions about my time at Cambridge, he knows, And if he knows, it will not be long before others do. The shame will be exposed, and with it, the truth about Roland's death. I am afraid, Venetia. I am afraid that I am going to be forced to pay for my silence, and I am afraid that the payment will be my life." Whimsy carefully refolded the document and placed it upon the potting table, his expression remaining entirely neutral, though his fingers had begun once more that telltale tremor. "It appears," he said quietly, "that your wife, Cannon, was not the victim of a heart seizure at all, but rather the victim of something far more calculated. Someone knew of her past, someone knew about Roland Ashford and the circumstances of his death, and someone was using that knowledge to apply considerable psychological pressure. The spiritualism, the conviction that she was being watched, the increasing agitation during her final days, all of these were the symptoms of a woman being slowly, methodically driven toward suicide by someone who understood precisely which psychological mechanisms to manipulate. The Canon had gone entirely white, his hands shaking with sufficient violence that he was obliged to clasp them tightly in his lap. "But that's monstrous," he said hoarsely. Why would anyone?" "The question," Whimsy interrupted, rising and moving toward the conservatory door with the purposefulness of a man who has suddenly understood the location of a missing puzzle piece, "is not who possessed the knowledge or the motivation, but rather who had access to your wife during these critical final days, who served her meals, who attended to the household, who might have observed her state of mind deteriorating and done nothing to prevent it. We must speak with the servants, Canon, and we must do so immediately, before Superintendent Crabtree files away his paperwork and seals the case against all further scrutiny." The servants' hall at the vicarage possessed that peculiar atmosphere of enforced cheerfulness that one encounters in households attempting to maintain normalcy in the face of disruption, and it was here that Whimsy and the Canon discovered the domestic staff assembled under the watchful eye of Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, a formidable woman of some 60 years whose expression suggested that she viewed the entire investigation as a personal affront to the efficiency with which she managed her domain. There were 5 in total: Mrs. Pemberton herself, the housemaid whose scream had discovered the body, a timid creature named Sally, whose fingers twisted perpetually in the fabric of her apron, the under-housemaid, the gardener Miriam, and, surprisingly, a nurse whom Whimsy had not anticipated finding in a household where no illness had been reported to require professional medical attendance. It was this nurse, a woman of perhaps 40 years, with sharp features and the sort of calculating gaze that suggested a mind always engaged in precise assessment, who immediately attracted Whimsy's attention, and he had scarcely begun his inquiries before her presence had resolved itself into the most pressing question of the morning. "You are not, I perceive, a member of the household staff proper," Whimsy observed, settling himself into a chair with the studied casualness of a man about to conduct an entirely different sort of interrogation than the Canon might have anticipated. "Your dress, though nominally that of a domestic servant, bears the subtle indicators of professional nursing, the particular wear on the left shoulder where a medical bag has rested, the calluses on the fingers of your left hand consistent with the administration of injections, the slight discoloration on your cuff that suggests contact with pharmaceutical preparations. Would you be so kind as to introduce yourself?" The nurse's composure, which had until that moment remained entirely undisturbed, underwent a minute but perceptible fracture. "My name is Miss Judith Crane," she said, her voice acquiring a quality of careful precision that suggested she was selecting each word as though it were a chess move on a carefully monitored board. "I was engaged by Dr. Harrington approximately 3 months ago to provide private nursing care to Mrs. Hardcastle. She was, as the Canon may or may not have informed you, experiencing considerable nervous distress, and the good doctor believed that professional oversight during the daytime hours might prove beneficial to her recovery." "How very thorough of Dr. Harrington," Whimsy observed, "and yet I note that no mention has been made of this professional oversight in any of the statements taken by the local police. Superintendent Crabtree appears to have accepted the notion that Mrs. Hardcastle was simply a woman of irregular habits whose death occurred in relative isolation. Did the superintendent not think to inquire regarding the presence of professional medical personnel in the household? The canon, who appeared to be undergoing a series of minor shocks with the regularity of a man receiving small electrical impulses, made a sound of protest. "I dismissed Miss Crane on Tuesday morning," he said quickly. Eleanor had become increasingly resistant to her presence, had insisted that she was interfering with her work in the conservatory. I believed, that is, I thought it best to comply with Eleanor's wishes. Miss Crane departed the vicarage approximately 10 o'clock on Tuesday morning, and therefore she could not possibly have been present when Mrs. Hardcastle died. Whimsy finished softly. "Yes, Canon, I quite understand the logic of your reasoning. And yet, Miss Crane, you remained in the village, did you not? I detect no baggage with you, no indication of hasty departure. Where precisely did you spend Tuesday evening and Wednesday morning?" Miss Crane's fingers had begun to acquire that furtive quality that betrayed internal calculation, and when she spoke, her voice had taken on a defensive edge that suggested she was preparing explanations rather than genuine answers. "I took rooms at the Crown Hotel," she said. "I did not wish to depart the village without first consulting with Dr. Harrington regarding the cessation of my employment. It seemed only professional to do so. I remained in my rooms, and I did not leave until Thursday morning, when I learned of Mrs. Hardcastle's death." "How very sensible of you," Whimsy said. "And yet the landlord of the Crown Hotel will presumably be able to confirm these movements." "You remained entirely within your rooms from Tuesday evening until Thursday morning. You did not, for instance, venture to the vicarage during the hours of darkness. Did not perhaps possess a key that Dr. Harrington had provided for emergency access." The nurse's face had acquired a greyish pallor, and her hands, which had until that moment been folded neatly in her lap, had begun to tremble with sufficient violence as to be obvious to even the least observant individual in the room. "Dr. Harrington may have provided me with a key," she admitted finally, her voice now barely above a whisper. "For purposes of emergency access, yes. But I did not use it. I swear to you I did not use it. And yet you remain extraordinarily calm regarding an event that would typically provoke considerable distress in a woman of professional conscience," Whimsy observed. "One would expect tears, recriminations, expressions of guilt that you had not been present to provide whatever care Mrs. Hardcastle might have required. Instead, I detect only anxiety regarding your own potential culpability. Tell me, Miss Crane, did Dr. Harrington provide you with specific instructions regarding your care of Mrs. Hardcastle? Specific medications, perhaps, or particular observations you were to make and report back to him?" "Nothing unusual," the nurse said, but her hesitation before responding suggested that she was exercising considerable selectivity in her truthfulness. Mrs. Hardcastle was experiencing nervous complaints. Dr. Harrington prescribed a mild tonic to settle her nerves, and I was to ensure that she took it regularly. There was nothing sinister in it, I assure you." Whimsy rose and moved toward her with movements that carried an undercurrent of threat entirely at odds with his outwardly casual demeanor. "A mild tonic," he repeated. "How remarkably vague. Did this tonic bear any particular label? Did it contain, perhaps, any ingredients that might not be immediately obvious to a woman of Mrs. Hardcastle's education? Laudanum, perhaps? Or something rather more exotic? Something that, when administered in increasing doses, might produce the very symptoms of psychological disturbance that brought you into this household in the first place?" The nurse had begun to perspire visibly, and her eyes darted toward the door as though calculating the distance to freedom. Before she could move, however, Whimsy had positioned himself between her and escape with the fluid grace of a man who had spent considerably more time in active service than his languid demeanor typically suggested. "I believe," he said quietly, "that it would be extremely unwise for you to attempt to leave this house without first explaining to me precisely what pharmaceutical substances you have been administering to Mrs. Hardcastle under the guise of medical care. Because if I am company, wrecked in my suspicions, and I confess I rarely am not, then Dr. Harrington has not been treating your patient for nervous complaints at all. He has been quite deliberately, and with considerable premeditation, driving her toward the very psychological crisis that culminated in her death. And you, Miss Crane, have been his instrument in that orchestrated destruction. Miss Crane's collapse into confession, when it came, was neither dramatic nor particularly eloquent, but rather possessed the quality of a dam, yielding to accumulated pressure, the waters of her resistance trickling away into admissions that she appeared to make with the mechanical precision of an automaton dispensing predetermined responses. She had been engaged by Dr. Harrington, she explained, not through any ordinary professional channels, but through a personal connection. He had known her brother years ago at medical school and had approached her with an extraordinary proposal that she undertake private nursing duties for a woman in his parish, a woman whom he believed to be suffering from incipient hysteria and in need of careful pharmaceutical management. The tonic she had administered was indeed laudanum-based, though in concentrations sufficiently subtle as to remain undetectable by the untrained palate, and her instructions had been explicit. She was to gradually increase the dosage, observing all the while for signs of psychological deterioration. Dr. Harrington had been remarkably precise in his expectations, she insisted. He had wished for Mrs. Hardcastle to experience particular varieties of distress, specific forms of anxiety that would manifest in increasing conviction that she was being observed, that some malevolent presence inhabited the household. "He said it would pass," Miss Crane said, her voice taking on the hollow quality of a woman reciting lines she no longer believed but could know. To cease speaking. He said that once the nervous crisis had reached its peak, he would prescribe a course of treatment that would resolve everything, that Mrs. Hardcastle would recover her equilibrium and remember nothing of the distressing episodes. But then the canon dismissed me, and Dr. Harrington seemed changed. He told me that the plan had altered, that circumstances had forced a modification to the intended outcome. He said I was to remain in the village and await his further instructions. I remained at the Crown Hotel, precisely as I stated, but on Wednesday evening, Dr. Harrington came to my room and informed me that Mrs. Hardcastle was dead. He seemed not surprised precisely, but rather satisfied, as though matters had resolved themselves in a manner he had anticipated, if not explicitly orchestrated. Wimsey had resumed his seat with the casual grace of a man who had just encountered confirmation of suspicions he had formed, but refrained from articulating, and his expression now held a quality of grim satisfaction that suggested the puzzle, though not yet complete, had begun to reveal its essential architecture. And did Dr. Harrington offer any explanation for this remarkable shift from pharmaceutical management to apparent sudden death? He inquired, lighting a fresh cigarette with deliberate slowness, as though the ritual of the action required his concentrated attention. Did he perhaps mention what had transpired in the intervening hours to necessitate such a drastic change in methodology? He said, Miss Crane replied slowly, that Mrs. Hardcastle had learned something. He said that she had discovered evidence regarding her own past, evidence that she had not known she possessed, evidence that implicated someone in circumstances that were considerably more grave than mere medical malpractice. He said that if she were permitted to live and communicate what she had discovered, the consequences would be catastrophic for all parties involved. He said that death was preferable to the scandal that would otherwise inevitably follow. The canon had risen from his chair and was pacing the room with the agitated movements of a man whose understanding of his own household, his own marriage, his own existence had been simultaneously shattered and reconstructed into a configuration that bore no resemblance to the reality he had inhabited moments before. But what could she have discovered? He demanded, his voice acquiring a note of genuine anguish. What evidence could she possibly have possessed that would warrant such extraordinary measures? Her past was buried, her secrets locked away in those blasted letters to Venetia Cross. Precisely so, Wimsey interrupted quietly. Which suggests, does it not, Canon, that Dr. Harrington's knowledge of your wife's past was itself remarkably comprehensive, that he possessed not merely surface-level information regarding Roland Ashford and the incident at Cambridge, but rather intimate knowledge of the circumstances surrounding that death, knowledge that could only have been acquired through first-hand experience or through conversation with someone who possessed such experience. The implications of this statement seemed to ripple through the room like a stone cast into still water, and it was the gardener Merriam, who had until that moment remained entirely silent in his corner of the servants' hall, who suddenly spoke with the voice of a man no longer capable of maintaining silence. "The doctor knew Mr. Rowland," he said quietly. "Knew him at Cambridge, I mean. I heard them speaking once, years ago, when Dr. Harrington first came to the parish. The canon and Mrs. Hardcastle had gone to hear him deliver a lecture to the parish council about modern medical advances, and afterward, and they were leaving. I was bringing the carriage round, and I heard Dr. Harrington say to Mrs. Hardcastle, he said, 'How very remarkable that we should meet again after all these years. I had not realized that you had married Thaddeus. When last I knew you, you were, well, circumstances were quite different, were they not?' And Mrs. Hardcastle, she turned quite pale, and she said something about the past being best left undisturbed, and then they both seemed to realize that the canon was listening, and nothing more was said on the subject. Wimsey had closed his eyes, and his fingers had begun their familiar tremor, though with considerably greater intensity than before. When he opened them again, his expression had taken on a quality of absolute clarity, as though he had suddenly perceived the entire structure of the crime laid out before him in architectural perfection. "He was the young man," Wimsey said softly. "Dr. Harrington was the student who challenged Roland Ashford to that meeting at the Backs. He was the man to whom your wife confided her shame, the man whose noble heart was moved to righteous action, the man who inadvertently precipitated a death for which he has carried responsibility these 34 years. And when he discovered, some 3 months ago, that your wife was deteriorating psychologically, when he realized that her conscience was beginning to fragment, that her secrets might soon be exposed, he saw an opportunity, not merely to eliminate a witness to his youthful involvement in a death, but to do so in a manner that would appear entirely natural, entirely consistent with the nervous complaints that had become her public persona." "But why?" the canon demanded. "Why would he risk so much? Why would he engage in such a monstrous deception?" "Because," Wimsey replied, "Dr. Harrington is not, I suspect, a man whose reputation would withstand screw. Tiny. Because there are likely aspects of his past, his family, his circumstances, that would be rendered untenable by the reopening of questions regarding Roland Ashford's death. Because guilt, canon, when it festers for 3 decades without relief, becomes not merely a burden, but a psychological poison that transforms ordinary men into instruments of their own dark impulses. And most importantly, because he believed, perhaps correctly, that by eliminating your wife before she could act upon her knowledge, he could restore the comfortable fiction of that accidental death, could return Roland Ashford to rest, and could preserve the carefully constructed facade of respectability that has sustained him these many years. The precise mechanisms by which Dr. Harrington had orchestrated Mrs. Hardcastle's death became, over the course of the subsequent hours, a matter of meticulous reconstruction conducted with Wimsey's characteristic attention to detail and a growing sense of grim admiration for the audacity of the crime's conception. Miss Crane, under careful but relentless interrogation, revealed that the tonic she had administered had not been merely a simple laudanum preparation, but rather a compound of considerably greater sophistication, one that included minute quantities of a substance that Dr. Harrington had carefully explained would, in increasing doses, produce the precise symptoms of psychological disturbance that manifested as conviction of being observed, of being haunted by one's past, of gradually fragmenting mental coherence. The genius of the scheme, Wimsey explained to the canon with something approaching dark appreciation, lay in its psychological rather than chemical dimensions, for what Dr. Harrington had recognized was that a woman already burdened by genuine guilt, already struggling with the weight of historical trauma, could be pushed toward the brink of psychological collapse, not through obvious violence, but through the subtle reinforcement of her existing anxieties. Every strange sound in the vicarage was interpreted as evidence of the supernatural presence she had begun to convince herself inhabited the household. Every glance from the canon, every moment of domestic distance, was incorporated into a narrative of accusation and judgment. The tonic merely provided the chemical foundation upon which this psychological architecture could be constructed with absolute certainty of its eventual collapse. "The brilliance of it," Whimsy observed, settling into a chair in the canon's study as evening fell across the vicarage, "lies in its appeal to medical authority. A respectable physician, concerned for a parishioner's welfare, engages a professional nurse to provide care. The woman receives medication, experiences symptoms, and these symptoms are interpreted as evidence of her own deteriorating mental state rather than as evidence of deliberate poisoning. The canon, well-meaning but fundamentally incurious, accepts the medical explanation. The servants gossip but are powerless to intervene. And all the while, Dr. Harrington has positioned himself as the concerned healer, the voice of reason, the one man capable of understanding and treating the affliction from which the poor lady is suffering. The canon had aged perceptibly over the course of the afternoon, his face acquiring the hollow quality of a man comprehending the full extent of his own blindness and complicity. But how could he be certain that she would die? He asked hoarsely. How could he possibly guarantee that the tonic would— He couldn't, Whimsy interrupted gently. That is the extraordinary aspect of this crime. Dr. Harrington did not poison your wife in the conventional sense. He did not administer a lethal dose of any substance. Rather, he, eated a situation of such psychological distress, such profound conviction of moral corruption and spiritual contamination, that he essentially drove her toward suicide, drove her toward the conviction that death was preferable to continued existence under the weight of such unbearable scrutiny and judgment. The hyacinth bulbs, Canon, do you see the significance? They were not a message or a warning, as I initially suspected. They were an act of desperate defiance, a final assertion of control in a life that had become entirely controlled by external forces. She placed her confession within the bulbs because she wished it to be discovered. She wished her truth to outlive her, even if she could not. The canon sank deeper into his chair, and for several moments nothing was said, the silence of the study broken only by the ticking of the mantelpiece clock and the occasional crackle of the fire. "What will you do?" he asked finally. "Will you contact the police? Will there be a trial?" "That," Whimsy said, his expression taking on the quality of a man contemplating several futures simultaneously, "depends upon a great many variables, not least of which is the question of evidence. We possess Miss Crane's testimony, certainly, though her credibility has been considerably undermined by her willing participation in the pharmaceutical deception. We possess the letters and the confessional note, though these speak more to your wife's state of mind than to Dr. Harrington's culpability. We do not possess the tonic itself, nor can we prove that any substance administered was other than what it purported to be. We cannot demonstrate that Dr. Harrington's actions directly caused her death, only that they created the psychological conditions under which she chose not to continue living. The law, canon, is a curious instrument. It protects men from the consequences of their most subtle crimes far more effectively than it punishes gross brutality. "Then he will escape punishment?" the canon demanded, with something approaching indignation. "A man will have orchestrated the death of his former lover, will have systematically driven her towards self-destruction, and he will walk free because our legal system is insufficiently subtle to encompass the crime." "I did not say that," Whimsy replied, a strange smile playing about his lips. "I said merely that the conventional mechanisms of justice would likely prove inadequate to the task. However, there are other mechanisms, other forms of accountability that operate according to principles rather different from those governing the courts. The question becomes whether you, Canon, are prepared to confront Dr. Harrington with what we have discovered, whether you are prepared to force him to acknowledge the truth of his actions, regardless of whether those actions can be prosecuted in any legal forum." The canon's hesitation was brief but informative. "If you believe it necessary," he said finally, "then yes. I am prepared to do whatever is required to ensure that Eleanor's death is not rendered entirely meaningless by the comfortable deceptions that have sustained her killer these many years." "Excellent," Whimsy said, rising and moving toward the window with the purposefulness of a man preparing to set in motion the final movements of an elaborate and carefully orchestrated performance. because I believe that Dr. Harrington should be invited here, to this study, this very evening, under the pretext of discussing your wife's death and the arrangements for her funeral. I believe that he should be confronted not with accusations but with evidence, not with threats but with the simple, irrefutable facts of his own actions. And I believe, Canon, that once Dr. Harrington understands that his secret, the true nature, of Roland Ashford's death, the genuine circumstances of that evening at Cambridge, is no longer secure, that it will be exposed to public scrutiny and ecclesiastical investigation, he will find himself forced to choose between silence and confession, between the comfortable fiction of his respectability and the terrible truth of his humanity. The canon rose as well, his expression hardening into something resembling resolve. "I shall send word to him immediately," he said. "He will come. He will always come when summoned, because he has never truly escaped the gravitational pull of his guilt, has he? He has merely orbited it all these years, drawing ever closer, ever more compelled toward the inevitable confrontation that awaits him." Dr. Harrington arrived at the vicarage at approximately 8:30 in the evening, his manner conveying that particular blend of professional concern and courteous solicitude that marks the physician who has been summoned to the bedside of a distressed patient, though in this instance his patient was not lying in fevered delirium, but rather seated in the study, composed and expectant, flanked by whimsy on one side and the accumulated evidence of his own machinations spread across the desk, like exhibits in a trial that had already commenced, without his knowledge or consent. The doctor was a man of perhaps 50 years, with the sort of carefully maintained appearance that suggested considerable attention to the impression one creates. His dress was immaculate, his bearing erect, his features arranged in an expression of professional concern that wavered only marginally when he perceived not merely the canon and whimsy, but also the figure of Miss Crane standing in the shadows near the fireplace. For a moment, his composure underwent a visible fracture, though he recovered with admirable speed, his face reasserting the mask of control, benevolence that had served him so effectively throughout his years in the parish. "I confess myself puzzled by this summons," Dr. Harrington said, his voice maintaining its customary tone of refined courtesy, though his eyes had begun that particular darting motion of a man calculating exits and possibilities. The canon indicated some matter requiring urgent discussion regarding his late wife's funeral arrangements. "I assume there has been some complication with the disposal of the body, or perhaps some question regarding the precise cause of death." "The cause of death," Whimsy repeated softly, as though the words were a particularly interesting puzzle requiring considerable contemplation. "A question most excellently posed, Doctor. Because, you see, the initial determination was that Mrs. Hardcastle succumbed to a sudden cardiac seizure, a diagnosis that appeared to satisfy all parties involved in the investigation, most notably Superintendent Crabtree, who seems to possess that peculiar capability of the rural constabulary to accept the most convenient explanation without subjecting it to any rigorous examination whatsoever. Yet, as I have examined the circumstances more closely, as I have interviewed those who attended upon the deceased during her final days, I find myself increasingly convinced that the cause of death was rather more complex than simple cardiac failure. Would you not agree, Dr. Harrington, that a woman who had been administered increasing quantities of a pharmaceutical preparation designed to produce psychological disturbance might, under sufficient emotional duress, be capable of taking her own life? That such an act might, upon superficial examination, appear to be a natural death, but would, upon closer scrutiny, reveal itself to be the culmination of a deliberate and systematic campaign of psychological and chemical manipulation? Dr. Hari. Ington's face had acquired a pallor that suggested the blood had been drained from his features with remarkable efficiency, and his hand, when he reached out to grip the back of a chair, trembled with sufficient violence as to require both his conscious effort and considerable willpower to conceal. "I have no idea what you are suggesting," he said, his voice acquiring a quality of brittleness that betrayed the fragility of his composure. "This is an extraordinary accusation, and I must insist upon knowing precisely upon what evidence you base these insinuations." "Miss Crane," Whimsy said, gesturing toward the nurse. who stepped forward from the shadows with the deliberate movements of a woman finally relieving herself of a burden she had carried far too long. "Would you be so kind as to describe to Dr. Harrington the precise composition of the pharmaceutical preparation you administered to Mrs. Hardcastle under his explicit instructions? Would you describe the manner in which he explained that the laudanum was to be gradually increased, that the psychological symptoms were to be carefully observed and reported? Would you describe the conversation in which he indicated that circumstances had changed, that the intended outcome had been modified, that Mrs. Hardcastle's death had become not merely a possibility but a necessity?" Miss Crane's testimony, delivered in the flat tones of a woman reciting facts from which all emotional content had been deliberately excised, proceeded with methodical precision, each detail more damning than the last, each revelation stripping away another layer of the respectable facade that Dr. Harrington had so carefully constructed. The doctor listened with the expression of a man watching his own execution proceeding according to schedule, and when Miss Crane concluded her account, silence fell across the study like a physical presence, heavy and suffocating. "You must understand," Dr. Harrington said, finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "that I never intended for her to die. I intended only that she should experience sufficient distress to be rendered incapable of action, that she should withdraw into herself sufficiently deeply that any claims regarding Roland Ashford's death would be dismissed as the ravings of a woman experiencing nervous collapse. I intended for her to recover, eventually, to resume her life in a state of confusion regarding what had been real and what had been the product of her own deteriorating mind. But she discovered something, some evidence that I had not anticipated, and when I learned what she had found, I realized that the only possible outcome was—" He stopped, unable or unwilling to articulate the conclusion to which his reasoning had led him. "Was her death?" Whimsy finished quietly. "Yes, Doctor, I believe I comprehend your reasoning perfectly. You convinced yourself that you were merely protecting her from the consequences of her own actions, that you were preserving her from the shame and scandal that would inevitably follow if the truth regarding Roland Ashford were to emerge. But what you were truly protecting, was it not, was yourself, your own reputation, your own carefully constructed position within this parish, your own capacity to continue living with the fiction that you were a man of honor and medical integrity, rather than a man whose entire existence has been constructed upon the foundation of a death for which you bear direct responsibility." Dr. Harrington had begun to perspire noticeably, and his hands, which he had clasped before him in an attempt at maintaining dignity, had begun to shake with increasing intensity. "What will you do?" he asked hoarsely. "Will you contact the police? Will you expose this entire sordid business to public scrutiny?" "That," Whimsy said, his expression taking on the quality of a judge contemplating sentence, "depends entirely upon you, Doctor. You possess, I believe, certain options regarding how this matter might be resolved. The first option involves my providing this evidence to Superintendent Crabtree, who will undoubtedly find the entire affair sufficiently complicated as to require assistance from Scotland Yard. There will be an investigation, a trial, or perhaps, given the subtlety of the crime, a determination that no crime has technically been committed, merely a series of unfortunate medical judgments and a woman's self-inflicted death. The second option, however, involves a rather different course of action. A resignation from your position, a withdrawal from the parish, a confession to the ecclesiastical authorities regarding your role in the events of 34 years ago. A life lived in genuine expiation, rather than in the comfortable deception that has sustained you until this moment." The doctor looked from Whimsy to the canon, and in his eyes there flickered something that might have been recognition, or might have been the final comprehension of a man who understands that his carefully constructed world has been reduced to rubble and ash. The decision, when it came, arrived not as a dramatic moment of capitulation, but rather as a gradual deflation, a slow collapse of the structures that had sustained Dr. Harrington's psychological equilibrium for so many decades. He sank into a chair with the movements of a man whose joints had suddenly become incapable of supporting his weight, and for several moments he remained entirely silent, his fingers pressed against his face as though he could somehow arrest the dissolution of the persona he had so painstakingly constructed and maintained. When he finally spoke, His voice had acquired a quality of profound weariness, as though the effort of maintaining his deception had exhausted reserves of strength that could not be replenished, and now that those reserves had been depleted, he possessed no remaining capacity for resistance or denial. "I was 23 years old," he began, his words emerging with the mechanical quality of a man reciting testimony he had rehearsed 1,000 times in the privacy of his own consciousness. "I was at Cambridge, reading medicine, and I was entirely, hopelessly, and foolishly in love with a woman named Eleanor Blackwood. She was not a student. Women were not permitted such privileges in those days, but she had come to Cambridge with her cousin to attend certain lectures, to participate in the intellectual life of the university in whatever limited capacity was available to her. She was brilliant, witty, entirely unconventional, and she seemed to regard me with a degree of affection that I interpreted as reciprocation of my own feelings. I believed myself capable of saving her from the circumstances in which she found herself, believed that my love and my professional prospects could provide her with the life to which her intelligence and spirit entitled her." He paused, and in that pause there existed volumes of regret and rueful self-awareness. Roland Ashford was the eldest son of a substantial family, a man of considerable charm and even more considerable ruthlessness. He had taken notice of Eleanor in the manner that men of his type take notice of women who cannot effectively resist their advances, not through any particular attraction, but rather through the simple fact of her vulnerability and the challenge that her resistance provided. He seduced her, or more precisely, he coerced her through a combination of social pressure and emotional manipulation into a situation that she had neither sought nor desired. When she revealed this to me, when she explained what had occurred in that room above the bookshop on Trinity Street, I was consumed by a rage so profound and so absolute that it obliterated all capacity for rational thought or moral consideration. Dr. Harrington's hands had clenched into fists, and his expression had taken on the quality of a man reliving trauma with undiminished intensity despite the passage of 34 years. I challenged him to meet me at the Backs, ostensibly to discuss his conduct and demand that he accept responsibility for what he had done. In truth, I intended to beat him to death with my own hands if necessary. But when we met, when we stood together on the riverbank in the darkness, something unexpected occurred. We argued. I made my accusations. He attempted to minimize and excuse his actions, and I lost control entirely. I struck him and he fell, and in attempting to regain his balance, he plunged into the river. I could have reached him. I could have extended my hand, could have pulled him to safety. Instead, I stood and watched him drown, watched him struggle against the current, and I did nothing. I simply stood and allowed a man to die, and in that moment of inaction, I became precisely what I had accused him of being, a destroyer, a man capable of taking another's life through the simple act of refusing to preserve it. The admission hung in the air like a physical thing, substantial and undeniable, and in the silence that followed it, Whimsy observed with the keen eye of a man trained to notice such things that the canon's face had acquired an expression of profound compassion, mixed with something approaching horror at the recognition of how thoroughly his own life had been corrupted by forces entirely beyond his control or comprehension. The official account was an accident. Dr. Harrington Contin. U.Ed, his voice now barely audible, as though shame had physically diminished his capacity for speech. The authorities concluded that Roland had simply lost his footing whilst attempting to walk along the banks in the darkness. There were no witnesses except myself, and I said nothing. I allowed the death to be recorded as misadventure, and I permitted my own role in the affair to remain hidden. More than that, I left Cambridge and attempted to construct an entirely new existence, as though by sheer force of will and geographical distance I could erase what had occurred. I became a physician. I established myself in this parish, and I believed, foolishly, arrogantly, that I had genuinely transcended my past, that the man who had stood and watched another drown had been replaced by someone capable of genuine virtue and moral integrity. He looked directly at the canon for the first time since beginning his confession. When I discovered that she had married you and taken your name, I was overcome by a complex mixture of emotions that I could not adequately process or express. Relief that she had found some measure of happiness and stability, certainly, but also guilt, profound and corrosive guilt, that I had never disclosed the truth, that I had allowed her to carry the burden of that evening alone, believing herself complicit in a death that I had deliberately facilitated. And when, 3 months ago, I realized that her conscience was fragmenting, that she was on the verge of seeking out Venetia Cross, and potentially reopening inquiries into what had truly occurred, I convinced myself that I was protecting her from the consequences of her own honesty. In truth, I was protecting myself. I was ensuring that the scaffolding upon which I had constructed my entire adult existence would not collapse beneath the weight of historical truth. Dr. Harrington rose from his chair with movements that suggested considerable effort, and he moved toward the window as though seeking escape through the simple act of gazing outward into the darkness. "I will resign from my position," he said quietly. "I will contact the ecclesiastical authorities and provide them with a full account of what occurred at Cambridge and what I have done to Eleanor in these final months of her life. I will accept whatever consequences follow from that disclosure. I will not flee, will not attempt to deny my culpability, will not hide behind legal technicalities or questions of prosecutorial burden. What I have done cannot be undone, but at least it can be acknowledged. At least the pretense of respectability can be stripped away, and the truth can stand exposed in all its ugliness and moral corruption." The canon, who had remained entirely still during this confession, finally rose and moved toward the physician, and what passed between them in that moment, a glance, a gesture, something entirely wordless, seemed to suggest that the canon had, through the process of witnessing Dr. Harrington's genuine contrition and acknowledgement of his crimes, arrived at some complex understanding regarding forgiveness and the limitations of human judgment. "I will accompany you to the bishop's office tomorrow morning," the canon said quietly. "I will provide my own account of what has been discovered, and I will ensure that the full context of these events is understood by the ecclesiastical authorities. It will be necessary that they know not merely what you have done, but why, that Eleanor's death was not the consequence of sin on her part, but of deliberate cruelty orchestrated by a man consumed by guilt and self-preservation." Whimsy, observing this exchange from his position near the fireplace, permitted himself the faintest smile, an expression that contained no triumph and no satisfaction, but rather something approaching recognition of the complex processes through which human beings arrive at moral reckoning, and the possibility, however limited, of genuine expiation through acknowledgement of truth. The departure of Dr. Harrington from the study occurred with a quietness that seemed almost anticlimactic given the extraordinary revelations that had preceded it, and Whimsy observed with characteristic detachment the manner in which a man confronted with the full extent of his own moral culpability could achieve a species of dignity through the simple act of ceasing to resist the inevitable consequences of his actions. The physician left the vicarage some 30 minutes after his confession, his movements suggesting neither haste nor hesitation, but rather the purposeful progress of a man who had finally surrendered to a force against which all resistance had proved futile. He would, as promised, present himself at the bishop's residence the following morning, and the machinery of ecclesiastical investigation would commence its deliberate, methodical process of determining the precise nature and extent of his transgressions. Whether criminal charges would follow remained uncertain. The law, as Whimsy had observed to the canon, possessed a remarkable capacity for failing to encompass crimes of extraordinary psychological subtlety. But the destruction of Dr. Harrington's professional and social standing appeared inevitable and perhaps deserved. It was only after the physician had departed that Whimsy turned his attention to the matter of Miss Crane, whose own culpability remained more ambiguous and considerably more complicated than that of her employer. She had participated in the systematic deception and chemical manipulation of Mrs. Hardcastle, certainly, but she had done so under the explicit direction of a man whom she had trusted as a medical superior, and her own willingness to confess and cooperate suggested a conscience that, however dormant it may have been during the preceding months, had not been entirely corrupted or deadened by her involvement in the crime. "I suppose," Wimsey said, settling himself into a chair with the deliberate grace of a man preparing for a conversation of some complexity, "that the question of your own future requires some consideration, Miss Crane. You have, by your own admission, administered pharmaceutical substances to a woman under false pretenses, have participated in a campaign of psychological manipulation, and have remained silent regarding these activities even after the subject of your attentions had expired. The police, when they inevitably learn of your involvement, will undoubtedly regard these actions with considerable severity. Yet I find myself inclined toward a degree of leniency in your case, if only because you appear to have possessed neither the malicious intent nor the psychological capacity for the calculated cruelty that Dr. Harrington has so thoroughly demonstrated." Miss Crane's face, which had undergone considerable transformation during the course of the evening, from the professional neutrality with which she had begun to something approaching genuine distress and remorse, now acquired an expression of cautious hope mixed with profound uncertainty. "I have no excuse," she said quietly. "I knew that what I was doing was wrong. I knew that the preparation I was administering was not a simple tonic, but I permitted Dr. Harrington's authority and his assurances that no permanent harm would result to overcome my own moral scruples. I was complicit in Eleanor's death, and I must accept whatever consequences follow from that complicity." "Indeed," Wimsey acknowledged, "and yet I confess that I have encountered situations in which complicity, however genuine, appears to warrant a response that distinguishes between passive participation and active malevolence. Dr. Harrington orchestrated this crime. You merely provided the instrumental means through which his intentions were executed. There is a significant distinction between these roles, though I am not naive enough to suggest that such distinction absolves you entirely of responsibility for your actions." He rose and moved toward the window, observing the darkened gardens with the attention of a man whose mind was engaged in calculations conducted entirely beyond the scope of ordinary comprehension. "I believe," he said finally, "that the most satisfactory resolution of this matter would involve your cooperation with the ecclesiastical authorities in their investigation of Dr. Harrington's conduct, followed by a period of genuine contrition and, perhaps, a deliberate attempt to redirect your nursing talents toward the service of those who genuinely require medical attention, rather than those who require chemical manipulation disguised as therapeutic intervention. The canon, I suspect, would be willing to provide you with a reference that, whilst not precisely glowing, would at least permit you to seek employment elsewhere without immediate suspicion of criminal involvement. Whether Scotland Yard takes a similar view remains to be seen, but I believe that if your cooperation proves sufficiently thorough and your remorse sufficiently genuine, the matter might be resolved without recourse to formal charges." The canon, who had been listening to this exchange, with the expression of a man still struggling to reconcile the various revelations of the evening with his own understanding of morality and justice, finally spoke. "I believe that Miss Crane deserves the opportunity you describe," he said quietly. "I do not presume to speak for Eleanor, but I believe that as he would have preferred a resolution that distinguished between genuine malevolence and the weakness of character that permits one to become an instrument of another's cruelty. Dr. Harrington acted with deliberate intention to cause suffering and death. Miss Crane acted under the direction of a man she trusted, and she has demonstrated through her cooperation in this investigation that her conscience, however dormant, remains capable of functioning." Wimsey nodded slowly, as though the canon's statement had confirmed conclusions he had already reached through his own processes of analysis and deduction. "In that case," he said, "I believe we might consider the practical matters of this investigation substantially resolved. Dr. Harrington will face ecclesiastical consequences that will certainly include defrocking and very likely include referral to the Crown authorities for possible criminal investigation. Miss Crane will provide her testimony and attempt to rebuild her life on a more stable moral foundation. The canon will be obliged to accept that his marriage, whilst not what he believed it to be, was nevertheless not entirely bereft of genuine affection and mutual regard." and Eleanor Hardcastle's death, whatever else it may be, will at least be understood correctly, not as the consequence of her own moral failure or psychological weakness, but as the result of deliberate cruelty orchestrated by a man consumed by guilt and the desperate need to preserve his own carefully constructed fiction of respectability. He paused, and in that pause there existed a moment of genuine contemplation, as though Whimsy himself was processing the emotional and moral dimensions of a case that, despite its extraordinary complexity and its resolution through confession, rather than through confrontation with legal apparatus, had nonetheless left in its wake considerable wreckage in the form of shattered illusions, disrupted lives, and the painful recognition of how thoroughly human beings are capable of deceiving themselves regarding the true nature of their own actions and motivations. "The matter of Eleanor's funeral," the canon said finally, breaking the silence that had begun to extend itself uncomfortably. "Should there be an investigation? Should the circumstances of her death be made public?" "That," Whimsy replied, "depends upon your own inclinations regarding truth and discretion. The official cause of death will remain cardiac failure, assuming Superintendent Crabtree is willing to accept Dr. Harrington's testimony that the examination was conducted with proper attention to detail and that his conclusions were accurate. The details regarding pharmaceutical manipulation and psychological coercion need not be disclosed to the public at large. They are relevant to the ecclesiastical investigation, but not necessarily to the general population of your parish. I would suggest," he continued, "that Eleanor Hardcastle deserves a funeral that honors her memory as a woman of intelligence and moral courage rather than one that exposes the details of her suffering for public consumption and salacious gossip. The truth canon is not always best served by complete and immediate disclosure to all interested parties. Sometimes discretion and compassion prove more valuable in the long term than the satisfaction of public curiosity regarding the mechanisms of private tragedy. The morning following Dr. Harrington's confession arrived with that peculiar quality of autumn brightness that renders ordinary landscapes momentarily luminous before the advancing season reduces them once more to grey monotony. And it was in this transient light that Whimsy prepared his departure from the vicarage. He had received word during breakfast that Superintendent Crabtree, having been apprised of certain developments in the case through channels that Whimsy preferred not to specify in detail, wished to conduct a final interview before closing the investigation into Mrs. Hardcastle's death. The superintendent, Whimsy suspected, remained thoroughly confused regarding the precise nature of what had transpired, but he possessed sufficient acuity to recognize that further inquiries would be counterproductive and that his original conclusion of death from natural causes could, with minor modifications to account for the testimony now being provided, be maintained without apparent contradiction to any inconvenient facts. The legal fiction, in other words, had been successfully constructed and would require no further adjustment. It was only as Whimsy was arranging his traveling cases, a process he conducted with the meticulous attention he brought to most undertakings, that the canon appeared in the doorway of his guest room with an expression suggesting that he harbored questions he had not yet found the courage to articulate. "I wonder if I might presume upon your time for a final conversation," the canon said hesitantly. "There remain certain aspects of this entire affair that I do not entirely comprehend, and I suspect that you possess insights regarding both the crime itself and the nature of my own culpability that you have not yet chosen to articulate." Whimsy set down his silver-backed hairbrush with deliberate care and gestured toward a chair with the courtesy of a man inviting a subordinate to participate in a conversation as an equal. "The question that troubles you," he said, "is not difficult to divine. You are wondering whether you might have prevented Eleanor's death had you possessed greater perception, greater attentiveness to her psychological state, greater willingness to engage with her past rather than to accept her careful I constructed fictions regarding her previous life. You are wondering, in other words, whether you bear some measure of responsibility for the catastrophe that has befallen your household." The canon nodded mutely, and Whimsy rose and moved toward the window, observing the morning light with the expression of a man considering matters of considerable philosophical importance. "Let me pose to you a hypothetical situation," Whimsy continued. Imagine that you had, on the day you married Eleanor, demanded a complete account of her previous life. Imagine that she had, in response, revealed to you the circumstances of Roland Ashford's death, her relationship with Dr. Harrington, the entire complex history of her time at Cambridge. What would you have done with that information, Canon? Would you have accepted it with equanimity, recognizing that you were marrying a woman who had experienced trauma and injustice? Or would you have done precisely what you did in fact do? Accepted a carefully edited version of her past because the complete truth was too complicated, too morally ambiguous, too challenging to your own understanding of respectability and propriety? The canon's silence was response sufficient, and Whimsy continued without requiring explicit acknowledgement of his accuracy. You married Eleanor precisely as she presented herself to you, a respectable widow of modest means with no inconvenient family connections or complicated history. She married you because you represented safety, stability, and the possibility of constructing an entirely new identity divorced from her past trauma. This arrangement was, in its way, a mutual deception, but it was not a deception born of malice on either party's part. It was a deception born of the simple human desire to escape from the weight of historical circumstance and to construct a life based upon present reality rather than past suffering. That is not a crime, Canon. That is simply the condition of human existence. And yet, the Canon said quietly, had I been more attentive, had I recognized the signs of her psychological deterioration more quickly. You might have delayed her death by several weeks, Whimsy interrupted gently. You might have summoned additional medical consultants, might have prevented her from spending time in the conservatory, might have insisted that she abandon her correspondence with Venetia Cross. In the end, however, you would have merely postponed the inevitable consequence of Dr. Harrington's manipulation. Once he had determined that Eleanor's silence regarding Roland Ashford could no longer be guaranteed, once he had recognized that she possessed evidence that threatened to resurrect questions he believed had been permanently buried, her death became not a possibility, but a certainty. The only variable was methodology, whether she would be poisoned directly or driven toward suicide through psychological pressure. Dr. Harrington selected the latter course because it offered him a species of plausible deniability, a way to eliminate a threat whilst maintaining the appearance of innocent concern for a parishioner's medical welfare. You could not have prevented this, Canon, because you were not the architect of the crime. You were merely an unwitting participant in circumstances that extended far beyond your comprehension or control. The Canon rose and moved toward the door, and in his bearing there existed a suggestion that he had, if not entirely accepted the absolution that Whimsy was offering, at least begun to recognize the limits of his own responsibility for the tragedy that had befallen his household. I shall ensure that Eleanor receives a proper funeral, he said finally. I shall arrange for flowers, hyacinths, I think, since she seemed to derive such comfort from them. And I shall commission a stone that acknowledges her intelligence and her capacity for genuine kindness beneath the psychological disturbance that marred her final years. And I shall attempt, over the years that remain to me, to construct some manner of life that honors her memory and acknowledges the genuine affection that existed between us, however complicated the circumstances of our marriage may have been. Whimsy smiled, a genuine expression that contained no irony and no artifice, and extended his hand to the Canon with the courtesy due to a man who has begun the difficult process of accepting tragedy as a fundamental aspect of human existence rather than as a personal failure or moral failing. That, he said, is precisely what Eleanor would have wished. And now, if you will excuse me, I must attend to the matter of Superintendent Crabtree and the final disposition of this case. I suspect he will require considerably less than an hour to understand that the investigation has concluded satisfactorily, and I have a train to catch that will return me to London by evening. As the Canon departed, Whimsy returned to his cases and completed his packing with the efficient movements of a man who had concluded his business in Little Marshfield, and was prepared to move on to whatever fresh mysteries awaited him in the complex urban landscape that constituted his natural habitat. It occurred to him, as he descended the staircase for the final time, that Eleanor Hardcastle had purchased her peace, however temporary. Through the simple act of placing her confession within the hyacinth bulbs, an act that suggested she had understood, with extraordinary clarity, that the truth of one's life and one's suffering could not remain permanently concealed, that eventually the weight of historical fact would assert itself regardless of the structures one constructed. To suppress it. It was a melancholy reflection, but it was also, he recognized, the fundamental truth that underlay all of his investigations, that human beings were creatures driven by the desperate need to construct narratives that rendered their own conduct comprehensible and morally defensible, and that the detective's role was not merely to discover truth, but to recognize that such truth, however terrible, was invariably preferable to the comfortable fictions with which people typically deluded themselves. He collected his hat and coat from the hall stand, nodded farewell to the servants who had assembled to witness his departure, and made his way toward the drive where the motor car was waiting to transport him to the railway station. As he settled into the vehicle, he permitted himself the faintest smile and murmured a classical quotation that seemed appropriate to the occasion. Veritas lux me, truth is my light. Though I confess, he added to himself, that it is often a rather harsh and unforgiving illumination.